The Vishari were an advanced species, both biologically and technologically. Their bodies were armored with a flexible but tough exoskeleton, reinforced by dense, layered muscle fibers beneath. Their blood clotted almost instantly upon injury, and their nervous systems dulled pain to near insignificance. In extreme cases, their bodies could regenerate missing parts over time, a natural adaptation that made their survival rate remarkably high. This biological advantage made them believe that creatures without such resilience were weak. Humans, with their soft, unarmored skin and easily broken bones, had always seemed fragile to them. The Vishari students studying xenobiology had learned about human anatomy and medical dependence. Unlike the Vishari, who healed without intervention, humans relied on artificial treatments, medicines, stitches, surgery. Their bodies could not handle severe injury without outside help. The students found this fascinating but also pitiful. Their professors had taught them that humans had evolved intelligence as a way to compensate for their biological shortcomings. Their technological advancements were impressive, but at the core, humans were weak creatures fighting against their own frailty. When a research expedition was announced to observe humans in a practical setting, many of the Vishari students eagerly signed up. The mission was a planetary survey, a joint operation with human researchers to explore a newly discovered world. The planet's terrain was rugged, filled with sharp cliffs, dense forests, and unpredictable weather patterns. The journey was meant to be simple, mapping the terrain, collecting samples, and studying the local ecosystem. The human researchers moved carefully, carrying extensive survival gear and medical kits, reinforcing the students' belief that humans were entirely dependent on their tools for survival. But then, something happened that changed their perception completely. One of the human researchers was traversing a rocky ridge when the ground beneath them crumbled. They fell hard, sliding down jagged stones before coming to a stop near the base of the ridge. The Vishari students, witnessing this from a distance, expected immediate distress. Surely, with their fragile bodies, humans would react with panic. Instead, the fallen humans sat up, assessing the damage. A deep gash ran along their forearm, torn open by a sharp rock. Blood seeped steadily from the wound. The students assumed the human would call for help, waiting for one of their companions to provide medical attention. But the human did not wait. Without hesitation, they reached into their pack and retrieved a small medical kit. The Vishari watched as the human cleaned the wound with antiseptic, wiping away the blood. They seemed calm, focused. Then, the students saw something that made them freeze. The human took out a needle and surgical thread. With deliberate precision, they pressed the needle into their own torn skin. The sharp point pierced through, pulling the thread behind it. The human's hand remained steady as they repeated the process, weaving the thread through their own flesh, closing the wound one careful stitch at a time. The Vishari had never seen anything like it. To them, pain was something easily managed. Their bodies numbed injuries automatically, and severe wounds were rare. The idea of deliberately pushing a needle through one's own flesh seemed unthinkable. The human, however, continued without hesitation. Their hands remained steady, their expression barely changing. The students had expected humans to be weak, but what they were seeing was something else entirely. The human's body had been damaged, but they had not allowed that to stop them. They had taken control of their own survival, forcing their flesh to mend through sheer willpower. The students realized that they had misunderstood human fragility. Yes, humans lacked natural armor. Yes, their bodies were vulnerable to injury. But that vulnerability had forced them to develop something else, a relentless endurance, a refusal to surrender to pain. The students had always believed their rapid healing made them superior, but now, They saw the flaw in their thinking. Their bodies healed automatically, but that meant they had never needed to master pain, never needed to override their own instincts in the face of injury. Humans, on the other hand, had spent their entire existence doing exactly that. It was not weakness, it was control. The human finished the last stitch, tied off the thread, and cut the excess. Then, as if nothing had happened, they wrapped the wound in a bandage, stood up, and resumed their work. The students remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. They had always thought humans were fragile because they could be injured so easily. But now, they understood. It was not their biology that made them strong. It was their refusal to stop. The Vishari were a species that prided themselves on their resilience. Their bodies were naturally armored, their flesh reinforced with a dense biological plating that could withstand most physical damage. Their internal structure was equally robust, fractures sealed within hours, deep wounds closed on their own, and even the loss of a limb was no more than a temporary setback, as they could regenerate most of their bodies over time. Pain was brief, an inconvenience rather than a threat. Because of this, they viewed humans as delicate creatures. Humans had no natural armor, no redundant organs, and no ability to regenerate. A single deep wound could cripple them, an untreated infection could kill them, and without medical intervention, a simple broken bone could mean permanent disability. The Vishari students, eager to understand different species, had studied humans extensively in their biology courses. Every lesson reinforced their belief that humans were one of the weaker species of the known galaxy. They had technology, of course, advanced medicine, protective gear, weapons, but all of it seemed like a desperate attempt to compensate for their fragile biology. When the opportunity arose to observe humans in the field, a group of Vishari students eagerly joined an expedition. It was a planetary survey, a joint effort between human and Vishari scientists, meant to study the geography and ecosystem of an uncharted world. The terrain was difficult, mountains cut through dense forests, rivers ran wild, and sudden storms battered the landscape without warning. The Vishari students watched as the humans moved carefully through the terrain, taking precautions that the Vishari did not need. The humans wore protective clothing, carried medical kits, and checked their footing on unstable ground. The students thought it confirmed what they had been taught: humans were slow and overly cautious because they had no natural defenses. Then, one of the humans slipped. It happened near the edge of a rocky embankment. The ground beneath them shifted unexpectedly, sending them tumbling down a jagged slope. They landed hard against the rocks below. When they got up, their arm was bleeding, a deep gash, torn open by the sharp stones. The Vishari students expected the human to call for help, to rely on their team for medical assistance. After all, that was what weak creatures did when they were injured. But the human did not panic. Instead, they reached into their pack, pulled out a small medical kit, and sat down on a flat rock. The students watched, puzzled, as the human calmly cleaned the wound with a liquid that washed away the blood. But what happened next left them stunned. The human retrieved a needle and thread. Without hesitation, they threaded the needle and pressed it into their own skin. The students had never seen anything like it. The needle pierced the raw flesh, pulling the torn skin together with each stitch. The wound was deep, yet the human showed no hesitation. They worked with steady hands, sewing their own body closed as if it were no different than mending fabric. The Vishari had never considered the possibility of such a thing. Their own wounds closed naturally. There was never a need to repair their own flesh. The idea of deliberately piercing oneself with a sharp object seemed unthinkable. And yet, The human continued, ignoring the pain, moving with a precision that spoke of experience. The students expected them to falter, to stop, to show signs of weakness, but the human did not flinch. They did not cry out. They simply finished the stitches, tied off the thread, cut the excess, and wrapped the wound in a bandage. Then, as if nothing had happened, they stood up and continued their work. The Vishari students remained still, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. They had always believed that humans were fragile because their bodies were weak, but what they had just seen was not weakness. It was something else entirely. The human's body had been wounded, but they had refused to let it stop them. They had taken control, repairing the damage with their own hands. The students had never thought about pain before. Their species did not experience it in the same way. When they were injured, their bodies simply healed. But humans did not have that luxury. Their survival depended on their ability to endure pain, to push forward despite it, to force their own bodies to keep going even when damaged. The students realized something that had never been taught in their lessons. Humans did not avoid suffering. They mastered it. They did not surrender to injury. They adapted. They did whatever was necessary to keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurt. The Vishari students had always seen their rapid healing as a strength, but now, they wondered if it had made them weaker in another way. They had never needed to fight through pain, never needed to keep going when every instinct told them to stop, never needed to force their bodies to obey through sheer willpower. Humans, on the other hand, had spent their entire existence doing exactly that. And that, the students realized, was why humans had survived despite their fragile bodies. It was not their strength that made them dangerous. It was their refusal to stop. The Vishari were a species built for survival. Their bodies were armored with thick, flexible plating that shielded them from harm. Their muscles were dense, their bones reinforced with natural composites stronger than steel. Injuries, if they happened at all, were sealed within hours, their cells working rapidly to restore damaged tissue. The concept of long-term injury or pain was nearly foreign to them. Because of this, they viewed humans as weak. The humans had no armor. Their skin was thin, their bones breakable. They relied on external tools, protective gear, weapons, medicine, to compensate for what they lacked. The Vishari, particularly their young students, could not understand how such a species had survived long enough to reach the stars. Humans seemed too fragile, too vulnerable. It was only through their machines and medical advancements, the students believed, that they managed to endure. When the opportunity arose for a group of Vishari students to observe a human-led expedition, they saw it as a chance to confirm their beliefs. The mission was a planetary survey, a combined team of human and Vishari scientists exploring an uncharted world with dense forests and unpredictable weather. The Vishari students were eager to compare their natural resilience to human frailty firsthand. The terrain was rough, the air thick with humidity, jagged rocks lined the riverbanks, and sharp, spiny plants grew along the ground. The humans wore protective gear, long sleeves, gloves, sturdy boots. The Vishari needed none of it. Their tough hides shielded them from the elements with ease. Midway through the survey, the group moved through a narrow gorge. The ground was slick from recent rainfall, and loose stones made every step uncertain. Then, it happened. A human scientist slipped on the wet rock, their arms striking a jagged outcrop as they fell. They landed hard, their face briefly contorted in pain before they pushed themselves up. The students saw it immediately, a deep gash along the human's forearm, blood welling up and streaming down their hand. The wound was serious. the kind that would have incapacitated a Vishari despite their rapid healing. The students expected the human to call for help, to retreat, to seek immediate medical attention. After all, that was what fragile species did. Instead, the human calmly assessed the injury, reached into their pack, and pulled out a small medical kit. The students watched in confusion as the human cleaned the wound, pouring a liquid over it that washed away the blood. The skin was still open, the gash too deep to simply cover with a bandage. The human seemed to understand this and pulled out a small metal tool, a needle, and a spool of thread. The Vishari students were stunned. Stitching was something they associated with repairing damaged fabric, not flesh. But the human, with a steady hand, threaded the needle and, without hesitation, drove it into their own skin. The students flinched. They expected the human to stop, to hesitate, to cry out. But the human did none of those things. They worked with practiced efficiency, weaving the thread through their own skin, closing the wound one careful stitch at a time. Their face was calm, their breathing steady. Every few seconds, the needle pierced fresh tissue, pulling the torn flesh back together. The students could hardly process what they were seeing. The idea of deliberately pushing a sharp object into one's own body was unthinkable. The pain should have been unbearable. And yet, the human continued, their movements controlled, their focus unwavering. Once the stitching was complete, the human tied off the thread, cut the excess, and wrapped the injury in a clean bandage. Then, without pausing, they stood up and continued their work. The Vishari students remained silent. Everything they had believed about humans had just been shattered. They had assumed humans were weak because they lacked natural defenses. But this was not weakness. This was something else entirely. The human's body was fragile, but their mind was not. They did not rely on quick regeneration or biological armor to survive. They relied on their own determination, their ability to endure pain and push forward despite injury. A Vishari with a wound like that would have been forced to stop, to wait for their body to heal. A human, however, had no such luxury. They did not wait. They adapted. It was in that moment that the students realized why humans had thrived in the universe despite their biological disadvantages. It was not strength that kept them alive. It was their refusal to be stopped. The alien students had been studying human biology for months. Their species, the Vishari, had long believed that humans were weak, fragile creatures. Compared to their own physiology, humans lacked natural armor, redundant organs, or rapid regenerative abilities. Their bones broke easily, their skin was soft, and their bodies seemed vulnerable to even minor injuries. The Vishari did not understand how such a species could survive, let alone thrive, in a dangerous universe. Their professors had told them that humans relied on technology and medicine to compensate for their biological limitations. When they were injured, they sought assistance. They had doctors, hospitals, machines to mend their bodies. Unlike the Vishari, who healed quickly and instinctively, humans required external intervention. The students accepted this as truth. Humans were dependent on others for survival. Then, during a field study on a distant colony world, they saw something that changed their understanding completely. The mission had been simple. A small group of humans and Vishari were working together to explore a remote, uncharted region of the planet. The terrain was rough, filled with jagged rocks and uneven ground. The humans, as usual, wore protective gear, thick clothing, boots, and gloves to shield their fragile bodies. The Vishari did not need such things. Their natural exoskeletons protected them from sharp surfaces, and their bodies could seal minor wounds within moments. As the group moved through a narrow canyon, one of the human explorers slipped on loose gravel. The fall was sudden, the sharp edge of a broken rock cutting deep into their leg. Blood spread quickly, staining the fabric of their pants. The wound was serious, deep, wide, the kind that would have left a Vishari incapacitated from shock. The students watched, expecting the human to panic, to call for help, to retreat. Instead, the human calmly assessed the injury. Without hesitation, they pulled out a small medical kit from their pack and set to work. The alien students observed in stunned silence as the human cleaned the wound, pouring a liquid over it that washed away the dirt and blood. There was no hesitation, no sign of fear. The next step was even more shocking. The human reached for a needle and thread, a tool for repairing fabric. The students thought at first, but then, with deliberate precision, the human pushed the needle through their own skin, pulling the thread tight to close the wound. The students could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The process was slow, methodical. The needle pierced the skin again and again, weaving the wound shut as if it were nothing more than torn cloth. The human's hands were steady, their breathing controlled. There was no visible reaction to the pain, no sign of distress. When the stitching was done, the human wrapped the injury in a bandage, secured it, and stood up. There was no collapse, no request for assistance. The human simply continued walking, as if nothing had happened. The Vishari students exchanged glances, their previous assumptions unraveling. They had believed humans to be weak, incapable of handling physical harm without extensive medical support. But now, they had witnessed something entirely different. Humans did not just endure pain, they faced it head-on, managed it, and moved forward without hesitation. For a Vishari, an injury like that would have been a serious matter. Their bodies healed quickly, but their instincts would have forced them to stop, to retreat, to wait until the wound had closed. The idea of willingly piercing one's own skin, of stitching a wound shut with crude tools, was unthinkable, yet the human had done it without hesitation. This was not weakness. This was something else entirely. It was resilience. The students realized that humans did not survive because they were physically superior. They survived because they refused to let pain stop them, because they adapted, because they pushed through injuries and hardships that would cripple other species. The Vishari had always believed their rapid healing made them superior, but now, they wondered if that very trait had made them weaker. If they had ever faced true hardship, true suffering, would they have been able to endure it the way humans did? The field study continued, but the students saw humans differently now. They watched how they moved, how they acted, how they never hesitated when faced with physical challenges. They understood now why humans had spread across the galaxy, why they thrived in environments other species avoided. It was not because they were the strongest. It was because they refused to stop. The human with the stitched wound continued working as if nothing had happened. No complaints, no delay. It was just another obstacle, another problem to solve. The Vishari students had thought humans were fragile. Now, they knew better.